Yeah. And do you think the inflation we may experience could get as bad as it was in the 1970s when we had stagflation? Some people are saying, oh, there used to be even worse interest rates and all these things. This isn't that bad and so on, which I guess is easy to say if you're, not in a more difficult spot. But do
Well,
you think that it'll get that bad?
well, I think it's already worse. I think the inflation we had this year is probably worse than any year from the 70s or early 80s. The highest the
Because of how
inflation rate
quick it
got.
was.
No. It's just we're just not measuring it the same. So the highest the inflation rate got in 1981, that was the high for the period of 1 year, was about 13.5%. And
Okay.
the highest year-over-year rate that we got was a little over 9. But you have to realize that we're not measuring prices the same way. So if we took the inflation or the CPI that was used back in the 1970s, and we use that CPI this year and last year, we would have shown annual increases close to 20%, far in excess of the worst of the 1970s. Or you can take it the other way around. If you used our CPI, the one that we have today, and you went back into the 1970s and you recalculated the inflation using the CPI we had today, they wouldn't have had double-digit inflation back then. The highest it would have got maybe was 7%, which is lower than where we are now. So we've already have higher inflation than we had back then. But it's going to get much, much higher than it is now because the U.S. economy is in far worse shape now than it was, let's say, going into the 1970s. I mean, you go back to 1970, the national debt was, I don't know, $500 billion, 500 billion or so. I mean, it got to $1 trillion in the early 80s. 1980, 81, it got to $1 trillion, but it was maybe 500 billion or less, probably less than that. So we had a tiny debt compared to the almost 32 trillion we have today. But also in 1970, even through 1980, the United States was the world's richest creditor nation, right? So the world owed us a lot of money. Today, we're the world's biggest debtor nation. In fact, America owes more money than all the other debtor nations of the world combined. In the 1970s and even into the 80s, we had trade surpluses. Every year, we sold more than we bought. So we were earning surpluses. Today, we have record trade deficits. So America is a different country. Back in the 70s, 80s, American families had a lot more savings to fall back on. You didn't have, all the consumer debt that exists today. And of course, during the 1970s, most women didn't even have a job. So you had a guy who was married, even if he didn't have a college degree, even if he dropped out of high school, the job he had was enough to support his wife and his kids. So there was still a spare laborer, right? So if times got tough, the woman could, get a job, help out, right?